It is so good to be with you all today for our fourth Conversations with Leaders event this year, all of which have been virtual in this new world that we are uh, becoming very intimate with, living and working in a virtual world. I want to say a very special thank you during this season of Thanksgiving to Dr. Bob Holsworth for joining us today. I know he's in high demand this time of year post-election to try and make sense of what we've all just been through and continue to go through in some cases. I also want to say a very special thank you to Atlantic Union Bank as our presenting sponsor and to our partnership with Timmons Group. We are very appreciative of that. And we're very glad to know that we've got a lot of Lead Virginia alumni, current class of 2020 members, and invited guests joining us all across this great Commonwealth. So welcome to everybody. I want to mention, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, that this is the season of Lead Virginia applications for next year's class. We have a class of 2020 that is underway, and being very resilient with the scheduling shifts that we've had to do throughout this year. But they are a great class. They've bonded very well, and we're looking forward to next year's class as well. So our applications for the next year's class are on our website at leadvirginia.org, and they are due in our office by January 15th. So that's my good commercial for Lead Virginia for the next class. I want to say thank you and welcome to Andy Kerr. Andy is a graduate of last year's class in 2019, and who knew what lay ahead for all of us, Andy, in 2020. Andy is a senior VP, vice president for middle market banking and a team lead for specialty banking. And he's going to share a little insight about what he's seeing and hearing with the economy through his position with Atlantic Union Bank. And following Andy, we'll turn things over to Joe Hines, who is a member of the class of 08 of Lead Virginia. He's a principal with economic development, in charge of economic development for the Timmons Group, and he serves on our Lead Virginia Board of Directors. So Andy, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, again, my name is Andy Kerr. I'm the commercial banking middle market team leader for Atlantic Union Bank here in Central Virginia. And yes, a proud graduate of the Lead Virginia class of 2019. Atlantic Union Bank has been a strong advocate and supporter of Lead Virginia for many years and is very excited to be the presenting sponsor for the Conversation with Leaders series. I just wanted to offer my congratulations to the current class of 2020. I hope you've enjoyed your earlier visits to Hampton Roads and New River Valley. I encourage you to continue to build that important social capital, not only with your current classmates, but with the leaders that you get to meet in each region. As Susan just mentioned, she asked me to share some brief thoughts about the current economic environment from the bank's perspective. And really, as with most businesses and organizations at the start of the pandemic, the bank prepared for the worst and really hoped for the best. And we spent a lot of time over the past several months talking with our customers to better understand the impact of COVID and what it's had on their industries and their organizations. And honestly, that impact has really varied greatly, with some having some very negative impact. If you kind of think hospitality, retail, restaurants, and then others have done very well, really due to changes in people's routines and habits as a result of the pandemic. So really a key economic indicator for the bank is typically the health of its commercial loan portfolio. To better understand this, we regularly track a number of factors, such as loans that are past due, and we consider them past due if they're 30 days past due from the time that the payment needs to be made. Non-accruals, so those are loans that are just not being paid, and of course charge-offs. Surprisingly, and up to this point, all these have been very low, really not much different from pre-pandemic levels. And I believe this is due really to a couple of factors. Early in the pandemic, many banks, including Atlantic Union Bank, provided payment deferments to those who needed it to provide some near-term cash flow relief. On the heels of that, the payroll protection program was rolled out, and I think as part of the CARES Act, you're very familiar with the PPP program. And Atlantic Union Bank was fully engaged in the program. We had the opportunity to process and fund over 11,700 PPP loans in April and May throughout our footprint, which includes all of Virginia and parts of Maryland and North Carolina. That really provided some much needed liquidity at the height of the pandemic. Most importantly, it kept people employed, staffing together, offset expected losses and shortfalls. And just as important, it continued that circulation of cash, that business to business payment for products and services, which is really the lifeblood of all businesses and organizations. Finally, I also think that we're starting to really see some improving operating performance, especially from those organizations and businesses that struggled earlier in the pandemic. Really could start seeing a marked improvement in August, September, and October. And I think that's part in due to the easing of restrictions. I think pent-up demand for their products and services, and frankly, organizations have continued to adapt to the current environment. We're certainly not out of the woods, and the outlook for 2021 is still very unclear for most organizations, given all the uncertainty. But with that said, recent feedback that we've been receiving at the bank from our clients has been very favorable. And certainly the loan portfolio performance has been encouraging throughout our footprint. So on behalf of Atlantic Union Bank, I want to thank you all for attending the Conversations with Leaders event today. To the class of 2020, I hope you enjoy the rest of your regional visits. It's a wonderful experience and something that I'll always remember and always be a very important part of my life. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe Hines, who will introduce our speaker today.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Andy, for that somewhat optimistic look into what appears to be going on within the banking system and in the economy from your perspective. So really appreciate that. Also, thank you for Atlantic Union Bank's sponsorship of the Conversations with Leaders this year. And Susan, for your leadership at Lead Virginia. I know this has definitely been a trying week for Susan, as the 2020 Lead Virginia class was supposed to meet in person in Richmond this week. And unfortunately, due to the governor's announcements, which are obviously in the safety of all Virginians, they had to reschedule the class from in-person to virtual, and they're going to have to push it back to June of next year. As we talked a little bit earlier, it seems like every 10 years we go through this life-altering or life-adjusting, business-adjusting type of events, whether it's 9/11 or recession or this pandemic. But in a lot of ways, we're lucky and blessed that we actually have the technology we do to stay as connected as we do. And so we're very, very fortunate to count our blessings in that fashion, as my mom used to say growing up. As Susan mentioned, I'm also on the board of Lead Virginia, and as of this morning, I have been appointed the nominations chair for 2021. So if anybody has an interest in Lead Virginia, please let me know, and we will be more than glad to chat with you and give you some more information about it. A couple of housekeeping and format issues before I introduce Dr. Holsworth. We'll have about 30 minutes worth of comments from Dr. Holsworth, and then we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function. That's going to be the best way for us to track it. We also had a number of questions that were already asked during the registration process, and obviously a lot of interest. Dr. Holsworth has a unique and keen insight into what's going on in the political world. And this has certainly been an interesting couple of years and definitely a very interesting election, from Virginia's political situation to the national situation and what's going to happen in 2021 and forward. So as Susan mentioned, this is the fourth in a series of the virtual Conversations with Leaders, and we have no doubt you will be intrigued with today's session entitled Post-Presidential Election, What's Next for Virginia? As mentioned, my name is Joe Hines, and I'm Principal and Director of Economic Development at Timmons Group. I have the good fortune of introducing our guest speaker, one of our top political pundits in Virginia, Dr. Bob Holsworth, who I not only consider a friend and a colleague, but just a good mentor, somebody very influential and very cool to talk to just about life in general. Dr. Holsworth is the Managing Director with DecideSmart, along with Lead Virginia's very own Dr. John Thomas. Prior to joining DecideSmart, Bob was the founding director of the Center for Public Policy and the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. He also served as Dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences, the largest unit of the 31,000 student university. Bob has occupied several key positions in a number of major governmental initiatives. He was the Executive Director of the Governor's Commission on Efficiency and Effectiveness. He has been the Director of the Virginia Executive Institute and Co-Staff Director of the Commission on the Future of Virginia's Urban Areas, a gubernatorial commission that examined how Virginia's urban areas could become flourishing parts of the regional economies. Not only that, Bob serves on the Board of Visitors at Virginia Commonwealth University. He received his BA from Seton Hall University and his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As an NC State undergraduate myself, the only saving grace in my book is the fact that Bob got his PhD there versus undergrad, where they actually probably re-inject you, take your blood out and re-inject you with Carolina Blue. So that's a good thing. Well, Bob, I must say, it looks like your job as a political pundit certainly has been secured for the next few years with this presidential election. I was able to listen to your comments yesterday speaking to the VCU's Wilder School students and alumni. And I thought you did a great job of framing up the presidential election, how it affects Virginia, and where you see Virginia heading in the next few years. Can you please provide our attendees with a similar overview and your perspective of the elections?
Yeah, okay, Joe, thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be with everybody today. It's always a little better to be with people after an election than prior to the election. There was a 19th century German philosopher who said the owl of wisdom flies only at dusk. And so I think it's a lot easier talking about what happened than trying to predict what's going to happen in American politics today. But let me really focus on three things here, or three items in this discussion before I take your questions. The first will be a very brief overview of the federal elections, about what happened and why they happened. Secondly, I want to talk about what happened here in Virginia on Election Day. And thirdly, what all that means coming forward in 2021 in Virginia, largely because, as you know, we have an election every year. I call it the political pundit full employment policy, but that's going to be very well, not only do we have a gubernatorial and the statewide candidates, but we have the House of Delegates. And this is an election that, as I'll talk about, takes place 1 year before the midterm congressional elections, and that's going to have an impact on how Virginia is perceived next year as well. So let me just begin with the overview of the federal elections. Joe Biden, in my point of view here, has won a pretty decisive victory over Donald Trump, that he received the same number of electoral votes, 306, that Donald Trump received against Hillary Clinton. And then secondly, he's winning by about 6 million votes, almost 4 points in the popular vote. I expect that to go to somewhere between 6 and 7 million, and somewhere between 4 and 5 points in the popular vote by the time all the votes are counted in California and New York. The Biden strategy was pretty simple, I think. That basically the focus was on rebuilding that blue wall in the mid-Atlantic and the upper Midwest with Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And he was successfully able to do that. He basically switched 40,000 votes in Wisconsin to give him about a 20,000 vote margin there. And in Michigan and Pennsylvania, he switched somewhere between 120 and 150,000 votes in each state, giving himself relatively comfortable wins, close to 150,000 vote margin in Michigan, and ultimately probably an 85,000 to 90,000 vote margin in Pennsylvania. So how did that happen? I think there were a couple of things. First, the defections that we saw in 2018 from suburban voters certainly impacted this election again. In the suburbs outside the major cities, Donald Trump did not do very well, did not do anywhere near as well as he did in 2016, and Biden was able to make inroads there. There are a lot of people who look at the suburbs, and the president is one of them, I think, who see the suburbs as predominantly white. And if you take a look at Virginia and other places, what you see is the suburbs have look very differently than they might have 20 and 30 years ago. They're multiracial. They have significant African-American populations in many cases, and that demography makes a change. But also what we saw in the suburbs is white men, in particular with college degrees, seem to move more toward more toward Biden than they had previously. Secondly, I think even though Trump did actually a little better among African-American males than he did previously. There was enhanced turnout everywhere, but there was also enhanced turnout in the urban cities that, really stymied Hillary Clinton in places like Milwaukee and Philadelphia in 2016, and that was better this time. And then finally, there was a very small but not insignificant cut that Biden made into Trump's base with white working class voters in Pennsylvania. I mean, it wasn't large. It was, in many counties, it was 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%. But when you add that up, that contributed to this 120 to 140,000 vote switch that happened in Pennsylvania. The second thing that Biden did nationally was that he expanded the Democratic map with narrow but important wins in Georgia and Arizona. In Georgia, you had the same suburban issue that I've mentioned before. That was huge. And you've had a multi-year voter registration effort led by Stacey Abrams that turned out to be extraordinarily successful in Georgia. In Arizona, you had the big county outside of the Phoenix area, Maricopa County, and that switched from Trump to Biden. And that was a state where Biden did well, particularly with young Latinx voters, even though in some other places like Florida, Cuban American and Venezuelan American voters went heavily for Trump and prevented Biden from making inroads there. But largely at the end, the Biden campaign was pretty disciplined and focused on rebuilding the blue wall. That was enough. We're now having the president in an unprecedented way not accept the results of the election. He has a ton of court cases going on. He has some strategies of trying to prevent certification in a variety of states. I think he's hoping that in some way he's going to find an instrument for getting this election up to the Supreme Court, where he appointed 3 of the members. But at the end of the day, at the moment, that certainly doesn't look very promising. And I think everyone is hoping that at the end we do have a peaceful transition and that this doesn't turn into something even worse than it is now, where you have polls saying 60 to 70% of Trump voters believe the election was rigged, which I've been able to see no evidence of. So on the other part of the federal side, the Democrats thought they were going to do far better than they did in Congress. The Democrats thought they were going to take the Senate. Certainly, you can recall all of those discussions that were had about, potentially packing the Supreme Court, adding members to the Supreme Court, and the Democrats were certainly ahead of their skis on that, because at the end of election, 2 weeks after the election, they've picked up 1 seat in the Senate and did not do anywhere near as well as they thought. The Senate is going to come down to these 2 special elections in Georgia. We've had special elections in Georgia in the past. Republicans win runoff elections, excuse me. In fact, one of the Senate races was a quote unquote special election. We've had these runoff elections in the past. Republicans tend to do very, very well in them. The Democrats have not done well in runoff elections. And if you look at this time, John Ossoff has actually ran behind Senator Perdue, so he would have to change that result in the runoff. It's going to be a turnout election. Whether the Democrats and the Abrams machine, you might say, can begin to change the historical precedents that we've seen here is an open question. I think it's hard to be that optimistic that the Democrats would win that. I think if you had to handicap this, this is certainly at least begins with at least a slight Republican advantage, given the fact that Perdue has already won an election against Ossoff. Ossoff was in a runoff for Congress a few years ago and lost that runoff as well. In the House, what we've seen is that the Republicans did far better than expected. The Democrats thought they were going to pick up 10 to 15 seats. Republicans should pick up close to 10 seats, really narrowing the margin that Nancy Pelosi has as the leader. Part of the issue is that some of those races in 2018 that the Democrats won in Republican-leaning areas, saw sort of a split ticket in some instances where people voted against Donald Trump, but did vote for their Republican congressional representative. I think once again, the Democrats went a little too quickly, too far. And I think some of the slogans that appeared during the summer, such as democratic socialism and defunding the police, probably hurt them in these swing areas where Republicans did better than they had in 2018. Turning to Virginia, the Virginia results, by and large, in my mind, simply put a punctuation mark, and I'd call it an exclamation point, on what has happened in Virginia over the last 15 or 20 years. If you take a look at the Virginia results, very similar to what we've seen. Since 2005, in elections for governor, senator, or president, the Democrats have won every election except for Bob McDonnell in 2009. And in fact, in most instances, the margins the Democrats are winning by is getting larger. So in this instance, Joe Biden had a comfortable, what normally would be considered a landslide win, a little more than 10 percentage points over Donald Trump. And Mark Warner won by 12 percentage points over Daniel Gade. Virginia, that had been a battleground state in 2008, 2012, and 2016, was basically an afterthought in this election because almost everyone believed that it had turned significantly blue. In terms of the results that we saw in this election, it was also very similar to the trends that we had been seeing for the last decade. And that is in the rural areas of Virginia, Donald Trump did as well as he did across rural America, which was extraordinarily well. In counties in the far Southwest that Bill Clinton might have carried in 1996, places like Tazewell, Trump got over 80% of the vote. In almost all the rural areas, except for the South Side communities where you have significant African-American populations, Trump not only carried them, but he carried them by absolutely huge margins. The problem for the Republicans, however, is that in the suburban areas, on the eastern, east central side of the state, they do horribly. In Northern Virginia, RVA, Hampton Roads, the Democrats typically run up very large margins right now, and they continue to do that in this election. In Fairfax County alone, Joe Biden won by more than 250,000 votes. That was his margin. I think at the moment it's about 252,000 votes out of a total margin of 450,000. Indeed, if you added up Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, and put Arlington and Alexandria there, that margin is greater than Biden's margin statewide. And then you've seen in this election, Joe Biden carried counties that Democrats hadn't carried in a long, long time. He carried Chesterfield County easily by 5 or 6 points. They hadn't voted for a Democrat since 1948, since president. He carried Virginia Beach cities. And that basically just mirrored what we've seen in the gubernatorial and senatorial races lately, where the Democrats are winning the 10 largest jurisdictions in Virginia. Republicans do best now in terms of their total margin of votes, not percentage, in the suburbs outside of Liberty University. Bedford, for example, gave a 24,000 vote margin to the Republicans. So what you've seen here is that it's just been devastating for the Republicans for years now in the eastern and east central metro areas and suburbs. And Donald Trump made it worse because the message that he had that resonates across many parts of America, particularly states with large rural populations, that he's going to drain the swamp in Washington, is perceived as almost a direct assault on the economy and lifestyle of Northern Virginia, the most populous area of the state. So I jokingly say that while Trump said he was going to drain the swamp in Washington, what he has actually done is drain Northern Virginia of Republicans. They don't exist any longer in elected office in significant part of the sort of more metropolitan, more metro urbanized Northern Virginia counties. In Fairfax County, for example, in the General Assembly right now, there is not a single Republican who represents part of Fairfax County in the General Assembly. There is one Republican who I believe represents part of Prince William County in the General Assembly. So what you've seen right now has been this Trump exacerbating the trends that we've had. And so for the Republican Party, the challenge going forward, which I'll talk about in a moment, is certainly how in the world you cope with this situation where you have this huge base in the rural areas, but have continually lost in the suburban areas. When we go to the congressional races in Virginia, they were basically a wash. They were a status quo. We started off with 7 Democrats, 4 Republicans. We ended the same way. No district shifted sides. The Republicans thought they had a shot to beat Elaine Luria in a rematch with Scott Taylor. That did not come off well. They lost by about 5 or 6 points in that match, and Luria won pretty handily. And the Republicans actually pulled money from Taylor with about a couple of weeks left in the campaign. Their big shot, they thought, was to defeat Abigail Spanberger with Nick Freitas in the 7th district, because that district includes part of Henrico, parts of Chesterfield, but goes all the way up to Culpeper. And it was a district that Donald Trump carried by 5 points, between 5 and 6 points in 2016. If Donald Trump had been able to do that in 2020, Nick Freitas would be the congressperson. But Joe Biden won the 7th congressional district. He won it by 1.1 percentage points. Abigail Spanberger ran slightly better than Biden. She won by 1.8 percentage points. But ultimately, the fact that Trump lost ground throughout, in the 7th district and lost, all those votes in Chesterfield, made an impact and enabled Spanberger to win on that front. The third election that was important in Virginia was certainly the selection of the Bipartisan Redistricting Commission. That will change the way we do redistricting. It will no longer be controlled only by the legislature. What will now happen is there'll be a bipartisan commission, 16 people, 4 Republican legislators, 4 Democratic legislators, 4 citizens who lean Republican, 4 citizens who lean Democratic, that will be selected by judges from a pool that the elected officials will provide. And the public, as it has in most states, when given this choice of changing the way they do redistricting, voted overwhelmingly in favor of it. Let me make a couple of comments about that. First, in terms of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party found itself in quite a bind, actually, because what had occurred is throughout the last decade, they had called for an independent redistricting commission of some kind. They had supported it, and Republicans had almost uniformly opposed it, but not entirely. There were certain Republicans who always voted for it, but it never really got out of, it never had a chance of succeeding because most Republicans were against it. After the Democrats took control of the General Assembly, the Republicans decided that, this principle was really good. This was probably something that would really benefit the state. It would be something for good government to have a bipartisan commission. And the Democrats were in a bind because they had supported it. And what happened is that there was a division that arose among the Democrats, some saying this was a bad idea, the particular commission that they formed. Others said it was a great idea, we had to go along with it. And there was enough Democratic support that it again passed the legislature and was put on the ballot as an amendment. What I would tell you is just this: it's almost inconceivable to me that the Republican Party nationally, could you imagine Mitch McConnell advocating something like this? Or even the Republican Party of 6 years ago in Virginia would have never embraced this. At the same time, so you have to give the Democrats credit for their virtue, that in still going around and endorsing this, they had done this. It's actually, however, fairly remarkable that a political party that had been basically not in control of the legislature for a generation, since 1994, would, as one of its first actions, support an initiative that takes control away from that party to help perpetuate itself in office for the next 10 years. So you can give the Democrats credit for their virtue, but at the same time, they may live politically to regret this. If they had maintained control, they would certainly be able to flip the 5th district seat where Cameron Webb came close, but not that close to beating Bob Good. They would be able to protect Spanberger easily, but they're not. In terms of what this commission is likely to do very, very quickly, the commission has this, it's kind of a contraption actually, because in order to get a map passed, you have to have support from 6 of the 8 legislators and 6 of the 8 citizen members, which means that you have to have both parties come together. The good government idea behind this is that now what you will have is that you will have these parties be encouraged to compromise and cooperate. And I think that's what they'll do. But how they'll compromise and cooperate is they will protect the incumbents, because that will be the easiest thing to compromise and cooperate on. And that is in fact what has typically happened in almost every state that has done one of these bipartisan commissions with supermajority approval requirements. So from my position, far better, probably better clearly than the system we have now, which really stinks. But will it actually usher in this new era of competitive, beautiful maps? Color me skeptical on that. Finally, going forward into 2021 in Virginia, what a year it's going to be. We have gubernatorial races and statewide races coming up. I'll just talk about the gubernatorial race right now. On the Democratic side, there are 4 candidates, I think, likely to run. 3 are who've announced: Jennifer Carroll Foy from Prince William, Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax up in Northern Virginia, and Jen McClellan, state senator from the Richmond area. I think almost assuredly former Governor Terry McAuliffe is also going to run. And once he gets in, he becomes, I think, the nominal favorite for the nomination. There are a number of Democrats who don't want him to run, who would prefer to see just somebody else have their chance. Most of those Democrats, I think, are supporting Jen McClellan. Justin Fairfax, who I would have thought 5 years ago would be a hugely strong gubernatorial candidate, is still fending off the after effects of the allegations of sexual assault and rape by 2 women who came public with those allegations. He says they're absolutely wrong, that he's a victim of a witch hunt. But at the same time, I think it's going to be tough for the Democrats to choose him when they have other alternatives who look pretty competent as well. Jennifer Carroll Foy is a very interesting background and choice for the Democrats. She's clearly the most progressive candidate in the race. And what she represents is the sort of progressive alternative, especially emerging in Northern Virginia, to sort of the traditional Democrat, which I would say the traditional Democrat that wins statewide office, particularly governors, are usually liberal and progressive on social issues, moderate, clearly pro-business economic development on economic issues. Carol Foy represents sort of a more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, kind of a party that's interested in not only progressive social issues, but more union-oriented in terms of economic issues, more worker-oriented. You may have seen in the House of Delegates, for example, they changed the name of one of the committees to the, putting labor first before corporations. And so Carol Foy is representative of that, and she will get some attention from that and some support from the progressive wing of the party. My take on it initially, as I said, I think Terry McAuliffe still has a lot of support. He's perceived by many Democrats as a good governor, has a ton of money. He probably still is the favorite. But this is a very unusual time where you have a party that's in power, as the Democrats have been, and going to have quite a competition for governor. The Republican side, the challenge for the Republicans is to find if they can come up with any candidate that can somehow mesh these, deal with their situation. And that situation is largely they're winning huge numbers in rural areas, but how can they sort of recover in these suburban areas of the state. They have one candidate who's announced, Amanda Chase, who will not be able to do that, but she at the same time is a hero to the Second Amendment sanctuary movement, to all of those people in the various counties who came to their state county supervisor meetings last year and asked to pass these measures, calling their county a Second Amendment sanctuary. Chase is going to have a lot of support from those people. At the same time, Kirk Cox, former Speaker of the House, is in the race. If you saw his announcement, what you saw is that he's concerned, he's going to have to run two kind of campaigns. In a nomination battle, he's going to have to run to the right in order to gain support from many of the Trump supporters. And then hopefully he thinks if he can win that nomination, come back to the middle. Emmett Hanger, kind of moderate, sort of former traditional Mountain Valley Republican, he's probably going to get in the race. Wonderful legislator, has been extraordinary in terms of his efforts to try to build the party together and care about the future of Virginia. Whether he can have the resources to run a significant statewide race, I don't know. There's a business person from Northern Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, will get in the race. But at the end of the day, that's the Republican challenge that I mentioned before. And then simultaneously, the same thing is going to happen in the legislative races where the Democrats have a 10-seat majority in the House. I don't know exactly what's going to happen in those races. Republicans think they can get some candidates and might knock off some Democrats. And here's sort of the framework. Republicans think that with Joe Biden as president, they won't have the same albatross around their neck that they've had with Donald Trump in Virginia. That they think they'll get people to begin to look at these races less in terms of sort of the national side and less in terms of a vote against Trump, but more in terms of where they are economically and politically. And the Republicans think that this is really going to be an opportunity for them. The two questions that I would have about that is, one, is in Northern Virginia, has the Republican brand just become too toxic that it won't be alleviated in one election cycle? Maybe it can be. And then secondly, here's the other thing that's going to happen, both I think with the gubernatorial race and the House of Delegates races in Virginia. And that is, it's going to be nationalized once again, because this race in 2021 is going to be seen as the first election of 2022. It's going to be seen as the first election of the midterms. And we've seen that in recent times, that Virginia has held all these elections in off years, originally because we wanted to denationalize our elections. We wanted them to be only about Virginia. But what's occurred is that because we're one of the few states that holds these elections, they receive all kinds of national attention, and I might add, national money. That one of the things that has occurred here in Virginia of late that has benefited Democrats is that in the past, almost all parties depended upon, for funding, resources from the Virginia business community. The Democrats have become somewhat less dependent on that in recent years as these races have become nationalized. Michael Bloomberg, Emily's List. And then secondly, the Democrats use something like Act Blue, a national Democratic progressive website to raise dollars for House candidates. In the last election cycle, when they were trying to flip the House, you had communities in Pennsylvania or Ohio adopting a Democrats delegates race in Virginia. I'm not sure that will happen now that Democrats have the majority, but this nationalization of the election will occur again in Virginia, because it will be seen by most of the media, and particularly the Northern Virginia media, which are the Washington media, as the first election of 2022. So whether or not the Republicans will be able to gain significantly because there's finally a Democrat in the White House, or do we see a continuation of the trend we've seen for the last 15 years, I think is the big open question going forward. And I'm sure it's a question that will keep people like me well employed for quite some time. And I'd love to take your questions or comments.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Bob. That was a great overview, and it's hard to believe you can pack that much information into 30 minutes. So a number of questions that we've had asked. We're having some questions asked from Q&A, and some that were handed in already. I guess one of the questions was related to following the elections, like during election day, the Republicans seemed to have a lead all the way up until like almost midnight, and it was very tight, like say between Trump and Biden, between Gade and Senator Warner. But then all of a sudden, it seems like, like a horse race. The Republicans appear either to be out in the head or neck and neck, and then in the stretch, Democrats just take a lot of votes down. What is kind of happening with that phenomenon?
Yeah, well, what happened was a result this time of the increase in early voting and the fact that the manner in which the State Board of Elections reported on that could have been done better. And I don't want to criticize the State Board too much. I've gotten too many little tiffs with them lately, but because I think they do a good job on trying to protect fair elections and have elections with integrity and all that. I think they do a great job on that. But what happened is that there was a ton of early voting in Virginia for the first time, because there had been legislation passed that actually said that you did not have any longer an excuse to have absentee voting. And so many localities opened up these early voting sites, and people flocked to them, particularly again in the Democratic areas. In many Northern Virginia communities, over 1/2 to 2/3 of the ballots were cast before Election Day in this early voting. And so what happened on election night was this. The electoral board, the state electoral board, reported the votes of the in-person voting that occurred that day, and didn't report the votes that came in from the localities on the early voting. And so what happened is that it became even more confusing, because what the state board, how they reported them, which led to all the confusion, was the state board reported it. Let us say there were 20 precincts in a locality, and they got the results of 18 of those precincts for in-person voting. On the state board website, it said 90% of precincts have reported. And so at one point, they had Daniel Gade leading by 200,000 votes with over 80% of precincts reported. And that went up on CNN. And I was at a television station that night getting calls from people I knew around the country, like, what's going on in Virginia? And what they should have done, which would have been one change that would have solved the problem, is they should have said, this is the percent of the total expected vote, because they knew how many people had voted early. They now knew how many people had voted in person. So instead of suggesting that 80% of the votes were in, or 90%, they could have suggested that 45% of the votes were in. And they could have also explained that these were not the votes from Fairfax County, Loudoun, Prince William, Arlington, and Alexandria. So that's what happened there. It was just a problem because the reporting mechanisms did not necessarily calibrate with the changes that we had made in enabling people to vote early.
Got it. Thanks so much, Bob, for that explanation. So there are a number of questions that have evolved around polling data, and why, these pollsters, they have the Democratic candidate Joe Biden so far in the lead, but then all of a sudden when people start voting, and this happened in the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton in the lead and Trump wins, what is there any fallacy with that? Obviously there's a fallacy in the system, but what do you think can be done to help fix that system, and what needs to be done? Because obviously there's a lot of money getting spent on pollsters, and campaign strategy is behind what the polls.
Yeah. I mean, so the first point is that the pollsters who are wrong, they were wrong everywhere. It was not only just the public pollsters, it was the campaign pollsters. The campaigns paid, millions of dollars to these folks, and they were often wrong as well. So here's what I would say. That on the national front, they were wrong by something, but probably it's going to turn out to be within the margin of error. The national polls, I think the average was like around 7 or 8 points. It's going to wind up to be a 5-point election nationally, not very close. So they were off by a little nationally. In 2016, actually, they were correct nationally. In some states, they were probably pretty accurate here. They were pretty accurate in Arizona. They were pretty accurate in Georgia, where they had it really nip and tuck races. They probably got, in terms of getting the direction right, they probably got it right in 48 of the 50 states, except for North Carolina and Florida. But where they missed the most were these races in the Midwest, the upper Midwest. They missed them by huge numbers. Washington Post, ABC had the week before in Wisconsin, Biden winning by 17. In Ohio, they missed, even, Trump won by 8. They had that very close. They missed by some in Michigan. I mean, Michigan wasn't really close, but it wasn't an 8 or 10 point race. It was a 3 to 4 point race. Pennsylvania was closer than they thought. So what's going on? First, I would say that I myself have become, I've done a lot of polling in my life, and I would just say the last poll I ever did for a client was just a poll of Virginians who, looked at newspapers or looked at media. And, I hired a call center, and I got the results back from the first night, and I found that like 75% of the people they contacted were over 65. They had no young people in the poll and whatever. And so there are weighting techniques that you can do statistically for this, but I became increasingly uncomfortable with trying to weight, 6 people under 29 as if they were, 17% of the population or something like that. It just became, I became questioned on that. Second thing that seems to happen too, and again, that, in some states they had it right, other states they were dead wrong, is that, I think 2 things are happening. One, I think there's a group of people in the country who see the pollsters just like they see all the other elites, whether it be the big government people, the big corporation people, or the big media people. The pollsters are just part of that elite people, and they don't even want to give them the time of day on that front. And then the other thing that seems to happen is that if you think, there's some bad news about your candidate or your candidate's behind, you may just be unlikely to talk to a pollster. You may be more likely to, less likely to do it. Now, why that takes place in Wisconsin, Ohio, and, Michigan more than other states, I don't exactly know. The pollsters thought they had made up for their mistakes in 2016. Basically, in 2016, they just said, we underestimated the non-college educated white working class vote. It came out in large numbers. We've made up for that. And in a number of states, they were just as wrong. So I'd be skeptical of, in all places, thinking the pollsters have it down. And that's not a bad thing, not to let them determine the election.
Great, thank you, Bob. So another question that come in pre this was, obviously the media has a lot of influence, and I guess the question would be, does the mainstream and social media have a little bit too much influence over our elections, and does the Federal Communication Commission need to kind of reestablish guidelines or think about some type of guidelines in terms of campaigns, advertising, and utilizing media outlets?
Extraordinarily difficult to do. I mean, I think the so-called mainstream media is no longer mainstream. I mean, that basically, more and more of the media is niche media. You have Fox, Newsmax, whatever, the America. I've lost the name of that one. But you have certain news outlets that are really there to promote conservative point of views, and you have outlets that are, certainly a little more liberal. I think CNN became even more liberal during the campaign. Because they saw Trump as totally outside of the American mainstream in some ways. So people, by and large, are now going to media outlets that confirm their point of view. The social media problems are even more sort of problematic in some fashion because of the fact that how do you define them? should they be subject to the same type of requirements that media are required to? Because they're totally outside of that regulatory mechanism. And at the same time, they're not only political instruments, they're instruments by which people communicate with one another in a variety of ways. They're instruments that are far more susceptible to manipulation by foreign or other influences, and they're outlets that people are getting more and more of their information from. So the real question is, how does one even begin to think about regulating them? And what you see right now is they are the subject of tremendous antipathy by both sides in Congress, that the Democrats think that they have enabled all of this Russian or outside interference, and they have given free rein to sort of the terrorist groups and disinformation. And on the other side, the Republicans believe they're censoring conservatives' ideas. So there may be some mechanism for giving them further regulation, but I just think it's almost out of control, and it's hard to see exactly what's going to be done that both sides could agree to. So I think we're in for this for a while.
Got it. Thanks, Bob. I think these questions kind of fall into two buckets. One is the federal elections, and then one state election. So I'll ask one more question related kind of the federal, bigger picture federal stuff, and then we'll get into the state stuff. So with what's happened with the 2012 voters, Obama voters that went to Trump in 2016, what was their influence in 2020? And then one of the questions that also came up was this refusal to concede the election and the fraudulent voting. What does that kind of mean for future elections?
So let me do the first one first, because I think it's a little easier. I mean, I think most of those voters stayed with Trump. I think there, as I said, however, there were some places where there wasn't. If you looked at Pennsylvania, county by county, and you looked at the places where Trump got 62.5% of the vote in 2016, he might have got 61.5% of the vote, or 61.25% of the vote in 2020. And so ultimately, when you just add that up, there's 800 here, 600 here, 700 there. That was very helpful for Biden. One of the oddities, for example, is that one of the counties where Trump actually did better is the county he's protesting the most, Philadelphia County. He actually did a little better because he did a little better among African-American males than he had done in 2016. Now, in terms of what's happening now, it's hard to look at this and think that it's not destructive from my point of view of democracy per se, that if all of a sudden you have significant percentages of Americans who believe that the elections are rigged, that is, that's pretty bad. I mean, we've had people who, quote unquote, did not always accept the results in some fashion. The people who believe that the Russians influenced the last election, or that Jim Comey eventually threw the election to Donald Trump. We've had people who probably never believed that the Florida results were, that George Bush actually beat Al Gore in Florida. But we've never had this sort of persistent attack, certainly in recent times, in recent memory, on the integrity of the system, where a losing candidate is suggesting that multiple states were bogus. Often, I might add, raising concerns about places where African-American voters vote the most. We've just never seen this before, in recent memory in the U.S. And it has a potentially, I think, damaging effect on democracy and the confidence in, democratic views. And it's done, I think, with very little evidence as well. But what's happened, I think, is that people's views have become so polarized and so hardened you're now seeing these polls where 70% of the people who voted for Trump believe that somehow it was stolen from them. That's depressing when you begin to think about what that means for the legitimacy of elections going forward.
Got it. So, and one, I'll apologize to our listeners who've asked questions about the federal election, but I want to touch on some of the state issues because we've got, I think, more questions than we actually have time for. But on some of the state level issues, Bob, one of the questions that was asked are are there issues that state candidates can raise that can help kind of bridge that divide between rural and urban Virginians? So, what if you were a Republican trying to run for the governor's seat, what are the issues that you try to bridge over to the Democratic voters? And if you're a Democratic candidate trying to bridge to rural areas, what are those issues you would use to try to bridge?
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats try a couple of issues that I think they believe are, can be successful. That's sort of broadband access, which is very important in a lot of places that don't have it. They talk about healthcare access to healthcare they believe is important. They're certainly talking about COVID relief to people who are in parts of the economy that have really suffered on that front. Secondly, on the Republican side, they need to, begin to emphasize some of these practical issues that impact the suburbs. I mean, that they really do have to talk about, transportation. They need to talk about these kind of issues that impact people's daily lives in the suburbs successfully. But I'm not sure that's enough. So at the end of the day, that I'm not sure it's kind of even just a messaging thing right now. The rural-urban divide is really, it's cultural as well as sort of messaging there. I mean, that you have, very different lifestyles, very different education levels, and you have on the rural side a belief, often justified, that their life has become much worse over the past 20 or 30 years, that their opportunities aren't good, their children are, the children get educated, they leave, their communities are under attack. And I look at this, and like in Virginia, there's 40 years of efforts to try to do it by, I think, very well-intentioned people. If you look at almost every governor, certainly from Mark Warner on, this notion of trying to bridge this rural-urban divide, trying to bring economic development to rural areas, all of that exists. But it doesn't change the politics very much at all right now. So my sense is that it's incumbent upon the parties to try to do something. I mean, if I'm a Democrat, I have to say my biggest worry is that if the Republicans begin to cut into some of those inroads in the suburban areas, I'm going to be politically dead because I'm losing 80%, 75, 80% in the rural areas. On the Republican side, they have to come to grips with the new Virginia and take a look at candidates like Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker, governor of Vermont, 3 states where you have extremely popular Republican governors that are bluer than Virginia overall. So their strategy there, the Republican Party has to deal with a crazy nomination process. The Democratic Party, I think, has to try to find a way to bridge the culture of sort of the highly educated suburbanites that support them and the metro area folks, and a rural culture that just sees them as uninterested in them in some fashion.
Got it. Thanks, Bob. So, speaking of kind of rural Virginia of sorts, I grew up on a tobacco farm, and obviously there's a lot of fertile land out there for potential marijuana or hemp growth and distribution. What do you think are the potential implications of Virginia looking to legalize marijuana?
I actually think, I was talking to Susan beforehand, I think that's going to be very positive and very popular. Because on one hand, there's some economic opportunity that's going to be associated with it very clearly. Secondly, it has important ramifications in the criminal justice system, especially for the African-American community. Young people are going to be completely in favor of it. and many people who have a friend or relative dealing with chronic illness, who have wanted to see this legalization occur, is there as well. I think increasingly, so long as it's seen as relatively regulated, so that there's still punishment for people who are, driving while impaired, or that there's some certain effort to ensure that it doesn't lead to harder drugs. My guess is that this is a game changer. And it is interesting that someone who's relatively politically cautious, like Ralph Northam, would come out in favor of, because I think what's happening is that this is a place where there is significant culture change, and all kinds of people throughout Virginia are going to find a reason to want to support it. There'll be opponents, but overall, for example, I think most Democrats will support it, and I think Republicans will be divided, but there will be significant Republican support for this.
Got it. Thank you very much, Bob. So the governor's biennial budget, essentially one governor inherits another governor's budget, and any sitting governor gets a full 2-year budget on their own. In the upcoming budget negotiations with all the impacts of COVID, what do you think are going to be Governor Northam's budget priorities for the budget for last year in his office?
Well, my sense of this is that it's really going to depend on what happens here with COVID. First of all, I'm pessimistic for the next few months about what's going to happen. I on my Facebook page, I keep a kind of running account of what's happening with COVID. And not only is it getting bad nationally, it's starting to get bad in Virginia. Today, this morning, hospitalizations jumped up by 100 to about 1,540 or something like that. And with the exception of 4 days in May, this is the largest number of people who've ever been hospitalized in Virginia with COVID, and that number is going up. The test positivity rate in Virginia is nowhere near as bad as it is in other states. Depending upon which test you use, it's somewhere between like 7 and 8.3%, but that's gone up from 4.6%. So my thinking is that unless we get quite a break, we could be in for more trouble with COVID going forward. Now we've found some ways to keep businesses open. We found some, there's certain businesses that are less affected, those of us who can use technology. But at the same time, I think that's going to be troublesome there. So my guess is that trying to, try to maintain the priorities that the governor has already set, along with dealing with the COVID situation, is important. And in particular, what has distressed me, and the state can't do this alone, it depends on the federal government as well, is that you just need to have, right now we're in a situation where we need a bridge to the vaccine. We're going to get this vaccine sometime probably in the middle of next year for everyone, by the middle of next year to the third quarter. So we just need to ensure that we kind of keep things going until then. And I'm very concerned about these small businesses in particular that have been hammered in certain industries by COVID, and lack of attention being given to supporting the workers or the small businesses until then. So that's what I'd like to see the sort of the governor's priority be in some way, is to focus next year on what we need to do for a bridge to this vaccine. Certainly the second thing that I think we need to really focus on is education. I think this has just been a catastrophe, especially for kids in areas that don't have broadband or don't have families that are accustomed to it. And you just have all kinds of people, who are all kinds of kids who are losing a year. And what happens after that year? I mean, are they going to be, have they lost more than a year? Have they lost what they had prior to that time? I think it's just horrible. And I wish there were actually more attention paid to this, about what are we going to do to make up for whatever we're losing on the education side. I saw this charismatic guy yesterday, Jeffrey Canada, who runs this thing called the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, that I've been impressed by for about 20 years. Just a remarkable organization. And what he suggested, which I hadn't even thought of, he said, we got these 40 million vaccine doses coming out in the next month. Vaccinate every teacher in America, so you can open some of these schools back up. So I just think it's imperative that we address these traumas that are occurring from COVID, both for the businesses and workers who have been hammered the most, and then secondly, focus on the children who really are, City of Richmond's going to have virtual school for a year on top of virtual school for the last 5 months of last year. I mean, this is reaching a crisis situation. So maybe I'm a little too passionate about this, but I hope that's where the focus of any new monies in this budget go to.
All right, Bob, I think the last question, we liked, Susan's one of the most optimistic and positive people that I think I've ever worked with in my career. She reminds me a lot of my mother on that front, always looking for silver linings. Obviously, if this pandemic had happened 30 years ago, or if this was like an Ebola type of a virus, we would have a much different impact. But from 30 years ago, we obviously didn't have the technology in place. Now, while we've kind of pseudo built our own little big brother with Facebook and stuff like that, but we have these robust data centers. We have the ability to communicate. We're sitting here on a Zoom call today. If you had to identify what are the silver linings coming out of this pandemic moving forward and try to end on a little bit of an upswing or a positive note, what would those be?
I think it's the innovation that's occurred. I mean, I think, overall, it's the technological innovation and the various work innovations and, the fact that we had this election with a, historic turnout in the midst of this pandemic, that we've really changed the way we vote. For example, on the political side, I think we're never going to go away from early voting again. We want election season, not election day. I think the technology, the fact that it's clear that we can work productively without sitting next to one, without being in the office every day, that's going to change dramatically. So there's going to be a lot of good things that come out of this. As well, if we can, once we get the bridge built to the vaccine. So that's my sense, is that both in politics and in the economy, I think we've done well. I think certainly there are good things that can come out of virtual education.
Speaking of technology, I think we just froze up Bob.
By the pandemic. So I think there are a lot of good things that are going to come out of this, because we're such a creative, innovative community, both in the country and the nation. But I wouldn't minimize the downsides either.
Excellent. Well, Bob, this has been very, very insightful. First and foremost, I would like to thank you for your time to speak to the Lead Virginia alumni and the class for 2020, as well as everybody else who can make it today, and more so for your leadership in the Commonwealth. I mean, it's obvious that you have a good grasp on everything that's going on. You're very well connected, and you really have a good perspective on what the future has to hold. And I know Larry Sabato uses the quote, "He who lives by a crystal ball soon eats ground glass." My impression of you is you don't eat much ground glass, because you seem to be very well grounded in your projections moving forward. So in closing, I would like to thank Atlantic Union Bank, and in particular Andy Carr, for joining us today, and them as our Conversations with Leaders sponsors for 2020. And then Susan Horn, President and CEO of Lead Virginia, for her leadership through these difficult times. On the board meeting today, John Thomas and her brought up the word pivot. Seems to be their new favorite word, and it seems like we're having to do that quite a bit. We'll be scheduling probably the next virtual Conversations with Leaders starting in 2021. Exact date and time to be determined based upon our certain speakers' availability. Susan, I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts before we end the webinar, but I'd certainly like for you or Andy to provide some closing thoughts.
Just to say thank you, Joe, for doing a great job at moderating. Thank you, Bob Holsworth and Andy Kerr and Atlantic Union Bank. And just in this season of Thanksgiving, for all of us to just stop and be grateful for the many good things that are in our lives, and the people that are in our lives and the many blessings that we will stop and be grateful for at Thanksgiving and throughout this year. Because as Bob mentioned, there is a lot, there are a lot of positive things that are coming out of these difficult circumstances of COVID, in spite of the challenges. But we all want you to stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Andy?
And I'll just echo that, and you know, I just grateful for the opportunity to participate today. And Atlantic Union Bank is wants to continue to be a strong supporter of Lead Virginia, for this wonderful opportunity for all the graduates and graduates to come through the program. And just to echo Susan, yeah, I hope everyone stays safe during the holidays, and hopefully we get on the other side of that bridge like Bob suggested here earlier. So hope you all take care.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. And for those of you who tuned in today, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. We know that this is a busy week, not just with pre-Thanksgiving activities, but with also a lot of webinars going on. And we had great attendance today. We sincerely hope that you and your families just have a very safe, COVID-free, hopefully, and happy Thanksgiving. And hopefully 2020 will be right around the corner, and we'll have a much brighter year in 2020. Thank you so much, and y'all have a great holiday season.